What's up, guys? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today, Bryan and myself are going to kind of just have an open, honest conversation with the state of some of the rather like ambiguity and confusion, I could say, in the stimulating reps versus, non-stimulating reps. How close should you be training to failure, and just a lot of the conflicting opinion, I think, around it a little bit. And then as a end consumer, right? So people like Bryan and I, and then, downstream listeners, what should or could you really want to focus on to help disseminate some of the information to make the best kind of just use of your time with your training and to not get too confused? So Bryan, do you want to kind of shape us up a little bit there, and then we'll jump into some updates?
Yeah, I think you did a really good job. The notes I had pretty much were the ambiguity of evidence-based information, the fact that you can have experts that are respected scientists or at least science communicators in the field, some saying that all of the evidence and the mechanisms point to, needing to be somewhat close to failure. And then you have others on the other side of the spectrum basically being like, no, look at these studies, and interpreting them maybe some of the same studies differently or referencing different studies altogether, showing that, hey, no, we don't even need to be 5 reps from failure, like 7 or 8 from failure can also produce results. So I think we're just going to kind of have an open discussion about that, and then address the question of like, if everything does work, then why are people spinning their wheels in the gym for years? If it's so easy to get results and you can be 7 or 8 reps from failure, what's the deal? Why is everybody not jacked? So these are kind of some of the questions we want to discuss today. And then prior to that, we'll just kind of get into some updates here. Do you want to start, since I just spoke for a second?
Yeah, I'll kick us off with updates. Kind of the biggest update I have is if you are someone who has previously purchased my Done For You client check-in system, I have a brand new feature I released today, so it will be well out by the time this episode drops, and that is the progress photo timeline. So I was trying to think of a way that for myself to make it a little bit easier, and I plugged some things in, and then I'm like, holy shit, this is incredible. And what's really sweet about it is now it automatically will stack all the check-in photos right next to each other. And then I put like what week it is, what day, and the average week from that, the average weight from that week. And what's really, really cool is like you can backport it to existing clients and stuff. So part of the things as I build out features now, I'm thinking like, okay, well, some of these coaches have been using this with like, dozens of clients at this point. How can I make this like a non-breaking change that they can just automatically like bolt on to one of their existing clients' sheets? And I'm really, really pumped that this one like will completely bolt on. It's a couple clicks and everything just like automatically works. So I'm really pumped about that. I've got some really cool feedback on it already. So if you are out there and are using it, there's a new feature for you. And if you're not, I'd recommend looking into it if you do have clients or you just want something to help you coach yourself with more objective bounds. So it's kind of the first one. I have decided also that I am going to add in 1 to 2 kind of dedicated cardio sessions per week, aiming for some zone 2 cardio. And some of this I would say is I'm kind of getting to a point where I feel like I just want to move my body in different planes a little bit, sort of thing. That's one slightly, but then also the kind of, I guess, fear that like I'm getting older. I'm 34 now, and all I really do is just like lift weights. And I want to make sure that like one of my biggest goals in my life is like aging like you have, Bryan, right? Still getting better. You look great. And I just want to make sure I'm like crossing my T's and dotting my I's. And I know that like since like the day I quit doing CrossFit, I haven't really done anything like athletically, like whatsoever. So that one I want to kind of start pulling in a little bit. And I think I'm going to start at like 20 minutes, even though zone 2 is supposed to be like 40 minutes. But I just know like I'm not going to fucking do that for 40 minutes.
So quick question on zone 2, because my perception of zone 2 is that it's actually pretty low intensity. Like zone 1 would be basically you get on an Airdyne bike after a CrossFit workout. This is how we used to implement it, right? You would get on an Airdyne bike and you would just kind of like casually, half-assed, barely even move the thing as you're just trying to like calm down and get a little more parasympathetic after your training session. And so I would say that was even to be honest, like it was like a really slow walk. It wasn't even like a purposeful walk type pace.
I remember.
So I consider zone 2 to be like a brisk walk unless you're in really, really good shape. And then maybe it's like a slow jog. Do you kind of perceive it the same way? Or are you looking at zone 2 more as like it is a jog for almost anyone at this point?
I'm really just going off the heart rate numbers.
Okay.
So as I started looking at it, I'm like, okay, this is zone 2. I think, please do not quote me on this here, I believe it's like 60 to 70% of what would be like max heart rate. And for me, running off some calculation stuff, that's like a 131 to 145 sustained heart rate. That's up there, sort of thing. Like I tried to do it on a spin bike the other day, and I couldn't get my heart rate that high without like my legs burning out I couldn't pedal the bike anymore. So I think that's just like a bad, maybe not the best modality to use. I'm sure like a stair climber or an incline walk would be a little bit better because you're supporting your own body weight sort of thing. But it was interesting. So there's the first part. The second is I do think I may have slightly kind of artificially improved heart rate numbers because I'm in a calorie deficit. Like my resting heart rate is lower than I feel like it actually is in reality. And then when I am trying to when I feel like kind of fatigued-isk, it's still hovering in the like low, it's like maybe a 110, 112 sort of thing. So I think the diet could be artificially kind of pulling that down. So much so that when I was doing my session the other day on the bike, I'm like, I don't think my Garmin, my watch is like accurate. So right when I ended, or as I was ending and I like slowed my cycling pace, I set a timer on my phone and I counted an entire, 60 seconds, and it was spot on with my Garmin. So I was like, well, okay, simple enough. So I'm just going to keep experimenting with it. And especially as I kind of like end my diet, which I have a note about now soon, and get back into higher calories and that sort of thing. It's just something I want to experiment with and seeing like if I stay in like better cardiovascular shape, can I get any potential training benefit from just being more metabolically fit, physiology. I have a hard time believing that is actually like a bad thing, especially within the bounds of like 1 to 2 times per week for a dedicated 20 to 30 minute session, like once or twice per week sort of thing.
Yep. Yeah, no, totally. I totally agree. And I actually just Googled zone 2 because I always 60 to 70% is what Google says as well. And I thought it was more like, 55 to 65 or 50 to 60. So it's slightly higher than I think my initial interpretation was. But I think that 60 to 70% of max heart rate is still low enough that if somebody is not conditioned, like they're a typical American overweight person, they're probably getting their heart rate up to zone 2 literally just by getting off the couch and going for a walk. So you may find that depending on the modality you use, that you're able to get there a little bit faster or easier than you thought at first. And then as you become more conditioned over time, it may you may have to push a little bit harder to reach the same level. Which is, it's all very interesting. Like I've, as you know, I've been instituting biking into my training now a couple times a week. And if I push hard, my heart rate is almost at my max. Like I don't even understand how the max can be my max if I'm just getting there by like going up a hill on my bike for 25, 30 seconds, and then I'm sustaining it. Like I can do 30 minutes sustained at like 150 beats per minute, which is, if my estimated heart rate max is 180, we're looking at like 150 out of 180, which is 85%. like 80% max heart rate. So I can sustain that for what would be considered like a zone 2 domain. And so it's interesting how it varies so much in the individual. And like just going out biking with barely any effort, it's still getting to that 60% number. Like I feel like I could keep the 60%, the lower end of that zone 2, almost forever. I don't know. I mean, I guess I would need to like drink water and eat food at some point, but I see no reason that I couldn't keep 100 to 110 beats per minute, which is kind of in that range, forever. So it doesn't feel hard. Whereas it quickly begins to feel hard as the heart rate percentage climbs out of that like kind of lower zone.
I got to see the next one. I'm probably going to do like an incline on the treadmill and then maybe like a Stairmaster, but like mine felt hard to where I'm like, fuck, dude, why is my heart rate not climbing? Like I literally did not make it into zone 2 over the entire 30 minutes. I think like
I think you maybe, it might have been just because you chose something that had like a muscular endurance component to it instead of just a cardiovascular component endurance. And then I also read that these modalities are best done where you're using your upper body and lower body simultaneously. So it's harder to get to where you want to go if you're just doing something that is lower body dominant. So like doing a bike where, you're having to use your arms as well or something like that is going to be more effective.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Cool. Yeah, continue.
Yeah, so I have... I'm nearing the weights where I put an end to my diet because I don't really see any benefit in seeing 189 pounds on the scale for myself. So that is probably this week. I've had a couple 190.x sort of thing. And it's just kind of like, kind of don't really care to be any leaner. I have realized that my lack of training abs over this year has definitely shown up in my physique.
Okay.
I'm pretty lean, but I still kind of like don't really have great abs, but I'll have like veins in my hamstrings, like all the quad veins and stuff are in. And I'm like, okay, like I didn't really train them. I really half-assed it this year on the abs, like, and they're straight up like much worse than last year. So I was like, noted. Maybe I'll train them.
Very interesting. Yeah.
It is. It has been. And then the last thing there is what I found is like really interesting. I'm still progressing the big lifts. Like the hardest one for me all week long is the hack squat. I had it today. And I'm still able to do it, but it just like costs me more. Like I am defeated when I get off that thing. And it's my first exercise on the day. And then I go into like a bent knee RDL, which I have to like push heavy. Fortunately, it's like dumbbells, which I feel like systemically are just not as taxing. But I mean, like by the end of my training day, like I was supposed to do calves, I was supposed to do abs, and I was like, hard fucking no. Like not even going to think about it. I'm out of here sort of thing. So it's been really, really interesting. It's like I can still make the progress, but it costs me like a lot of just my soul to make the progress, which is just interesting because now that I'm nearing the end, I'm going to be going into my favorite nutrition periodization, which is like the recovery diet, where everything just continues to get better for a number of weeks. And I'm interested to see like, can I really still progress this hack squat like another 10 kilos or something like that? So I will report back as I continue that for sure.
No, it's very interesting. It actually fits perfectly in line with kind of the theory I've discussed on here, which is that, we don't actually physically reach a point of failure. It's usually that we reach psychological fatigue or like a lack of motivation or desire to attack the exercise more than like a physical inability to manifest into the machine and progress type thing. So it's just, that's like, it's super interesting to me because like you're on this diet, you're in a calorie deficit. There's the argument that it's it's newish. Like it's not like you've been doing this for years, the same machine. Like, you're on this hack for what now, 2 months or something like that. What has it been? Is that right?
Almost 4.
Almost 4. Yeah, I actually had this argument with Dave and Abel in our WhatsApp group because I was like, look, I'm still progressing on my hack and I've been in my training for at least a year. And Dave was like, yeah, I think a year is like just not quite long enough. Like you guys really have to do the same exercise like weekly for 2 years before you've completely exhausted all the neural gains. And I was like, I don't know, like 2 years is a really long time on the same exercise, you know? But they do continue to happen, and you do continue to kind of just figure out little tips and tricks along the way that make you more efficient at the movement. So yeah, it's very interesting. I actually would love to hear stories from the listeners where they really reached a point on a movement that they literally physically couldn't progress it, versus it just being like psychologically they didn't want to do it, or they just kind of gave up mid-set or something along those lines. Because like I've said, I kind of think that it's usually psychological. And of course, there's downstream effects of like once your psychology goes, like it could manifest itself physically. There could be the question of like, why are you psychologically fatigued? Like, is your nutrition bad? Is your sleep not great? Are you stressed out? And so these psychological factors are then creating this physical limitation type thing. So there's a number of ways you can look at that. But assuming that all of those variables like sleep, nutrition, and stress are taken care of, and you're in a surplus, et cetera, I do find it interesting to think that you would physically be unable to continue adding a rep after a number of weeks or whatever.
Agreed.
Or 2.5 pounds or something like that. Okay, cool. Should I jump into some updates? Are you good? Sweet. All right, cool. So for me, I am just in the process of finishing up my week 5 or microcycle 5 of my training program, and I have one session left to complete microcycle 5, which I will be doing here tomorrow, and then I'm leaving for 4 days to go to Tahoe for a wedding. And this will be the very first trip that Kim and I are taking away from both kids. Bryson is literally a month away from being 5 years old, and we have yet to get away from both of these kids for any amount of time. So it's actually been quite a stressful last week because we have my aunt coming to do a night. We have my mom coming to do 2 nights, my dad coming to do a day, and 2 different babysitters coming to do a day. So we literally have like 6 people to handle 4 days of us being gone, and trying to organize, grocery shopping and putting together activity lists and do's and don'ts, and all that stuff has just been a massive undertaking. Not to mention that all of these people are obviously staying in our house, and they can't stay in our basement where I'm podcasting right now because then they can't hear the kids. So they have to stay in our bed, and then we have to have changes of sheets every time somebody new is coming to stay at our house. Literally each night, we have to have like a change of sheets ready to go for them because people are weird and don't want to sleep on the same sheets as other people. So anyway, it's been a huge week of getting shit done. But we are obviously really excited to get away and have this wedding to go to. I'm sure I'll be doing some drinking and some palatable food intake. And most of all, I'm just looking forward to not training. So this is my kind of typical frequency deload, as I talk about, where this is one of my preferred ways to drop fatigue in the middle of a training cycle, is instead of getting to 5 weeks and doing a proper deload and then having to basically like build back up to where I am. I'm just basically going to take 4 or 5 days off and then just keep chugging along for another 3 weeks or so. So I'm essentially going to get like 8 or 9 weeks out of this mesocycle, instead of it being 5 weeks, then a deload, then a new mesocycle beginning. So my intention really is to not even change intensity. Like one of the things that you have to do when you take a deload is you then have to kind of backtrack and work yourself forward again. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to see what happens here. I'm already into like partial reps and reverse drop sets and rest pause sets and all this stuff. So we'll see if 4 to 5 days off has any kind of mitigating effects on my recovery thereafter, or my ability to manifest performance. My theory, hypothesis is that I'm going to come back from this trip and probably actually be stronger and be able to perform better because I had these 4 or 5 days off. But whether that leads to like an excessive level of soreness / muscle damage, I don't exactly know. So it'll be an interesting experiment to see if like 4 to 5 days is long enough that I'm going to come back and just be thrashed by stuff. Because the way it is right now, where I'm like, here's an example, is yesterday I did leg curls and hip extensions for hamstrings. Leg curls had a reverse drop set and hip extensions had lengthened partials. And my hamstrings are lightly sore today. And then it was kind of the same idea for quads. I did a reverse drop set on leg extensions, but then just did regular straight sets for B stance pendulum. And my quads are also lightly sore today. So that would be kind of as I expect being in week 5. I wonder if coming back after 4 to 5 days off, I kind of do that same workout again and maybe I get more sore. I don't really know. So I'll keep y'all updated and let you know as that progresses. So my foot, I am now 6 weeks since my torn plantar fascia. I think I gave this update last week, but just for those that maybe didn't hear, or just to reiterate, I did have it assessed by an orthopedic surgeon, did ultrasound x-ray, and found that I completely tore the medial plantar fascia. So that would be the inside arch of my plantar fascia, and there was a partial tear of the middle plantar fascia, which is the one that runs in the middle. The lateral one would be the one on the outside of my arch, and that one is fully intact, which is kind of why I've been walking pronated for the last 6 weeks. I've started my rehab. I think I mentioned that last week too. So I have this cool Mobo board, and I've been doing these foot drills and stuff on there. So it's starting to rebuild some strength. I was able to do some really slow calf raises to full range of motion yesterday. No weight or anything like that. I just literally stood on the edge of a stair and I would go to dorsiflexion and then to plantar flexion, trying to push through my big toe because that's the part that correlates with the medial portion of my arch. So I've been doing all that stuff and that seems to be progressing well, but like I still can't walk long distances. I definitely can't run. I can't change direction. I can't jump. So I think this is just going to be one of those like slow things that happens. And I don't know, maybe 6 months from now, I'll report back and be like, yep, I can run again or something like that. But it's kind of frustrating and annoying. And then as I've kind of mentioned and alluded to in prior episodes, there's been a decent amount of compensation occurring where my left knee primarily has taken the brunt of this as I've been compensating for my right foot. And my left knee's been bothering me enough that I scheduled an MRI. And did I mention on the last episode that about the okay, cool. So back in like 2016, 2017, we were doing this CrossFit workout as I discussed before, and it was like a 2 or 3 heavy back squats immediately into a 100-meter sprint. And I know I did something to my knee. I guessed that it was meniscus at that time just because of the stability component. But it got better, 3, 4, or 5 weeks later, I basically didn't notice it anymore. And so I just kind of continued going through life. And now we're 5 or 6 years later, and I still wasn't really noticing it much aside from on leg curls. Every now and then it would kind of feel like this little rolling over sensation as I would get to deep knee flexion, where it would almost feel like something was rolling over something else. And then it would go away and it wouldn't happen for a few months. And so it was kind of this thing where I like knew something was wrong, but it wasn't cumbersome enough to do anything about it. But since all of this compensation stuff has been occurring, the knee's been hurting a lot more, and it's been more aggravated when doing leg curls and other hamstring dominant movements. So I went and got an MRI a couple days ago, and as I suspected, the result was a torn meniscus in my left knee. Luckily, that's a relatively easy procedure of, scoping it, getting rid of it if that's the route we decide to take. And then, 2-3 weeks later, you're pretty much back to normal. The other thing that the MRI showed was that I have a small tear in my quad. It didn't specify, or at least the doctor didn't tell me which portion of my quad. I'm actually very curious because I guess now that he mentioned it, in deep knee flexion, it does feel like a little stiff in the very, very bottom, but I assumed that was kind of related to the meniscus. So I don't know if what I'm feeling is this like little quad tear that he said, or if it's the meniscus itself, but it hasn't been super limiting. And he said that should just be a matter of shooting it with some PRP when they do the meniscus scope, and that should more or less facilitate healing there. But this is interesting because I'm now almost 40 years old and I've never had a surgery. This will be potentially my first surgery in life at 40, and it's a relatively minor one. But I am slightly nervous that I feel like my body is beginning to demonstrate some breakdown that maybe I haven't noticed over the years. And, you hear this from people all the time, and these stories are in the back of my head of like, yeah, everything was great until I hit 40 and then it's all downhill from there, like these old guys by the campfire type thing, drinking a beer. So I don't know. I'm just hoping that's not my situation and that this is an outlier, and then I'm kind of just back to normal and everything's good from there. But other than that, like my body still feels great. So I'm not complaining. It just, now I have something that I potentially need to take care of. Any thoughts on any of that?
You're going to be perfectly fine after the procedure. And you will not be one of those guys at the campfire talking about how their body is broken down at 40. You'll probably be one of those dudes on Instagram at like 55 who's still fucking shredded and looks great. That's where I'm putting my money.
Yeah. I hope so, man. I follow, Jeff Albert's 3DMJ Godfather, and he's 51 now. And he and I have followed a similar journey. Like we started training at the same time. So he's now 36 years into training and I'm, 25 years into training or whatever. And he has said that, his late 40s into where he is now has really been like a change for him, where he feels like he has to, warm up a lot before each session, and like he'll wake up and his shoulder will be bothering him, or like any other number of little things. And so I'm just hoping to make it to my late 40s and not be that old guy on Instagram being like, yeah, my late 40s, man, my low back every day type thing. So we'll see. I appreciate the support there. Cool. So the last update I have here before we jump into the topic is the cardio stuff. And because I mentioned it earlier in relation to your cardio stuff, I'm not going to go crazy on it, but I have been continuing to see adaptations occur, which has just been so fun. It's something that you just don't get to experience 25 years into training, is seeing rapid improvements in things. And so I have been, and it's been really cool. Like even like my long courses, I'm seeing minutes improvement. So like my 10-mile course, I improved by like 3.5 minutes last time I did it. And then my 2-mile course, which is obviously a much faster bout, but it went from 7:39 2 weeks ago was my top time, and I just did it in 6:49. So I dropped 50 seconds off of a basically under 8-minute bout. And it was miserable. The 2-mile course, oh my God, like that 7-minute time domain is just so awful. It's like that 1 mile running, all out effort type thing, or a 7-minute AMRAP CrossFit workout. It's so bad that I only do that 2-mile loop if I'm literally just so crushed with work and life that I don't have time for anything else. But I would much rather go out and do like a zone 2 bout for 40 or 50 minutes than have to go push myself that hard for 6 or 7 minutes. So I thought that's interesting because that's kind of the opposite of what I used to be, which was kind of just, work hard, rest, recover type thing. I guess maybe I would still prefer that because 7 minutes isn't exactly like a work rest interval. It's kind of just a work, like a just go type thing. But yeah, I got my heart rate up to my max heart rate with my bike on its hardest gear. And so that was like the craziest thing to me, because you always talk about how to get your heart rate up, you need this super fast turnover. And I was going up this hill that I was doing, and I had my bike on the 24th gear or whatever the hardest gear is, and still hit basically max heart rate. So I'm sure my max heart rate is actually higher than what the formula says that it is. And I noticed that there's two formulas. There's like the 220 minus age, and then there's a new one that they came out with that's supposed to be more accurate, and it's something like 205.8 minus in parentheses 0.685 times age, I believe. So that one basically gave me the exact same number. It was actually lower. So 220 minus age puts me at 180. And then the other new formula put me at 178.5 or something along those lines. And I was hitting 178 on my bike ride. So for whatever that's worth, I thought that was pretty interesting. I'm sure that there's some cardio nuts out there that can explain to me how, when I put this poll on my story, like 65% of people said they regularly exceed their max heart rate as depicted by formulas, which is kind of a lot of people to be exceeding what is supposed to be a max heart rate. So very interesting how those formulas are not completely accurate, and then potential variables that might play into how or why someone might be exceeding that heart rate. And then the last thing about my cardio is that I've always been a staunch proponent of avoiding cardio around leg days, whether it's before or after, within a matter of a few hours up to 24 hours type thing. And I've been breaking that rule almost purposefully, because I think that it's kind of a fun experiment to see, like, hey, if I do a really hard bike ride a few hours before leg training, does it affect it? Or if I do a hard bike after a leg training, does that impact recovery? And thus far, I've seen no detriments in performance or recovery, objectively or subjectively. So I think that the key there being that I am in a surplus, and this, I still am a staunch proponent of avoiding cardio almost ubiquitously, if in a diet, until you need to do it to facilitate a caloric deficit. But I think in a surplus, we're realizing, and science has kind of solidified this, that in a surplus, you're able to implement concurrent training with very little drawback.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. In that, just more adequate resources for recovery, and your signaling is going to be much, like the signal is going to be much more heavily broadcast in a surplus, because of all the adequate calories to support those.
Yep. Cool. Well, do you want to drop some initial thoughts on this conversation here, and then I can color the commentary a little bit?
Yeah, let's try and do it that way. So kind of this episode comes from a couple weeks back. I picked up Chris Beardsley's hypertrophy book. It is literally just called, I think, Hypertrophy by Chris Beardsley. And as I was reading through it, which it's a dense read, by the way, what I do really like about it is he repeats himself like multiple times, so that as he repeats himself, like it's kind of like solidifying the things in your head. Because if he covers it like once or twice, like you'll just never remember it, because it's quite heavy, like scientific jargon of the mediums for cascades and stuff, how hypertrophy works. So what was really interesting, with me as I'm reading through it, and then I would send some like screenshots of things to Bryan. There was some profound parts that I've like shared on my Instagram stories and stuff, that a lot of things that I had like kind of thought to be generally accepted, he was kind of saying like, no, not really, right? So we kind of have like three kind of mechanisms for hypertrophy, right? We have mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. In the case, I am only still 50% of the way through the book, so I'm not going to come to any concrete things here. But Chris basically broke down the metabolic stress aspects and the muscle damage aspects, and saying that like the really underlying, cascades of these is just mechanical tension. So at the end of the day, like we just want mechanical tension sort of thing. And even going as far as saying that like things like muscle damage is actually worse for hypertrophy, because that muscle protein synthesis on the back end of it first has to repair the damaged tissues before any can be used for creating new tissue or increasing the size of the existing tissue. So it's kind of really like eye-opening for me in that. And then as I just continue to read more and have conversations with Bryan, there's been different conversations that come out of it. And we've been talking about how it's just kind of frustrating to have, like we said earlier in the episode, multiple experts looking at the same data set and coming to different conclusions, and how it can be just kind of confusing for your lifters in the gym deciding what is the best or most appropriate approaches for them. So we kind of just or with using these. So we just wanted to have a little bit of an open conversation about it, and then hopefully be able to come up with a TLDR at the end of takeaways for it's probably best to look and consider, these large aspects. So
did as far as you've been in the book thus far, has he mentioned anything about stretch mediated hypertrophy?
Yep.
And did he specify kind of along the lines of, the most common argument I'm seeing right now, at least amongst my followers, is the idea of some muscles responding to it and some muscles not. And Paul Carter being very close with Chris Beardsley and him putting out all this information about how the biceps, the triceps do not respond to stretch mediated hypertrophy, whereas many other muscle groups do. Has Chris touched on that at all?
I haven't seen it yet in the book. However, the book is now, I think, over 2 years old. It came out in 2019. Yeah. So I think some of these this research is just newer. So I haven't seen any kind of his standpoints on that stuff with the biceps or the triceps specifically. Cool.
Yeah, I think a lot of the stretch mediated hypertrophy studies have actually been in the last 3 years. So that would make sense that maybe that's not included in there. But we had Cass on, and he was kind of talking about how all muscles do at some level. And then Paul is kind of on the other side of the spectrum of saying that the biceps and triceps do not. So that would be one example of what you're saying, how the experts tend to disagree on something. You can literally look at the same study and have these differing views on it. And Chester Soko being on the other side of that and being yes, every freaking muscle responds to stretch mediated hypertrophy, and the mechanisms don't change type thing. But yeah, the Beardsley stuff is really interesting, especially as it pertains to effective reps. And I think that that's the kind of basis of this conversation, the main disagreement that we're going to focus on within the evidence-based space right now. And so there's a few studies that we can reference, and I've made some notes here. And the main kind of big one that I always think about is the Carston and colleagues, I believe it was, from 2019. And this one is a volume equated study where they took either 5 sets of 10. No, it was 4 sets of 10 or 8 sets of 5. And they used the exact same weight. So the group that did 4 sets of 10 essentially used their 10 RM. And I don't exactly know whether they dropped weight each set to maintain 10 reps or if they just let the reps fall and it was around 10 reps. But they basically did 4 sets of 10 to failure. And then the other group used the same weight, their 10 RM, but they did 8 sets of 5. So you can assume that the first set was at least, 5 RIR, and then the subsequent sets were maybe 3, 4, something like that. This study doesn't fully take you to the spectrum of what happens at 7 or 8 reps from failure. But this study did show that the group that trained further from failure had better strength gains across the board, which doesn't surprise me. Strength is a skill. Going to failure and having slow grinding reps is probably not great for neural adaptations. And then they found that the group that trained to failure had slightly better hypertrophy than the group that wasn't training to failure. So this is one that the failure proponents or the effective reps proponents will often cite and say, look, the group that trained to failure clearly had more hypertrophy. And no one argues the strength side because that it kind of ubiquitously across the evidence-based space, we realize now that training further from failure is better for strength gains. And so do you have any thoughts on that?
No, the one thing, I say no and then I start talking. The one thing I will say is with studies, it's really, really hard, right? Especially because there's the jargon in them is very complex. But if you actually look, and if you were like a trained person listening to the episode and reading some of these studies, if you look at some of the prescriptions done in them and actually think about it, you start to question some things. So there was one that Chester, who we just thought, Chester Soko,
yep.
who we were just talking about earlier, he posted one recently, and it said it was comparing, I'm going down a slight aside here, comparing 1 minute rest times to a 3 minute rest time. And I'm like reading it. The prescription was 5 sets of 10 at 85% of a 10 rep max using a leg press and a bench press. So like lengthen to mid range overloaded exercise.
Yeah.
85% of that, 5 sets of 10, 1 minute rest in between. There's no way in fucking hell you can complete that. No way.
Yeah, so did the reps drop off, or did they lower the weight
completed.
each set?
That's what they said, it was completed. Volume was equated between the groups. That's not an 85% of a 10 rep max.
Yeah, so you're basically doing like a 1 or 1 to 2 RIR, and then you're expecting that doesn't actually depreciate or deteriorate from there.
60 seconds on a leg press.
Yeah, there's no way.
So when you look at some of these things, like you just start to question some of the things of like, is this volitional failure that can't really be a 10 rep max? Like, so I think it's hard because these are the best information we have, but by no means is it always perfect. And that's like the caveat sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really well said. It just to put an overriding kind of big gray cloud on any of these discussions is it's issues like that. And it's issues of, does the population being studied even represent me? Like, does even a recreational male that's trained with 2 to 3 years experience represent somebody with 20 years experience that's close to their genetic potential? And then when you see a study like on untrained females and you're like a super trained male, you're kind of like, yeah, I just don't know. And like the argument from the researchers is always, well, you're going to see the most dramatic changes in untrained people because they're going from nothing to something. But like, I get that, like that makes sense. It's not applicable necessarily to those that already have that base of training experience. So always just take it with a grain of salt as we talk about this stuff. But one of the coolest things that I stumbled upon in my research for this topic today was a mass discussion between the 4 authors of Mass, Greg, Eric, and Dr. Zordos. And maybe I should just call them all doctors except for Greg because he's not a doctor. So anyways, basically what they did is in 2020, they had a discussion within, it was a written, I like it this way. They wrote out their points so they can each have time to kind of think about it, and then they would respond, and it would have the author's name and then their point and then the author's rebuttal to that, et cetera, et cetera. And so the overriding precedent of this discussion was that Greg Nuckols and Eric Trexler tend to feel that you need to be a bit closer to failure, and they referenced 2 to 4 RIR here as kind of the lower end of the range for hypertrophy. And then you have Eric Helms and Dr. Zordos on the other side of the equation, basically saying that no, you can get hypertrophy at 5, 6, 7, even 8 reps from failure. And so they kind of, cited studies and the specific points of each study that they thought were most relevant to their arguments here. And Greg's take was that anything lower than 5 RIR gets a bit iffy in the research. And he referenced the Martorelli study that had people training with approximately 7 RIR, and the failure group grew twice as much as a volume matched non-failure group. And so that's a really solid one to lean on if you're looking at that, where you're like, man, 7 RIR, that's exactly in the realm of argument that Zordos and Helms take. But they're finding that the failure group grew twice as much. And the fact that it's volume matched is also a huge feather in the cap of training to failure, because oftentimes what you see in these studies is like, well, failure wins because, they're both doing 4 sets, but one group's going to failure and one group's leaving 5 or 6 or whatever RIR. Well, of course, that's not a fair comparison. But then kind of the devil's advocate argument to even like assuming, so say you had a study where it showed, okay, we're volume equated, and then now you have the non-failure group growing as much as the failure group. Then you have the question of, okay, practically, does this make sense for me to have to do, even using the Carston study example, do I want to do 8 sets of 5 when I could do 4 sets of 10? And so you kind of see similar things like that across a lot of studies. What do you think about that?
So that's kind of like a note that I was actually just putting down into my like wrap up points, is like, if time is a consideration for you, which for many people it is, you can get potentially as effective of hypertrophy with fewer sets if you take them closer to failure, and then you can obviously subtract all the extra minutes of rest periods and stuff of doing like 4 sets or whatever. So I mean that's a very practical way to look at some of it for someone who's considerate of their time, for sure.
Yep. One of the really quality arguments that Dr. Helms made here, aside from basically talking about how volume equated changes the parameters of the discussion a bit and the time commitment for potentially the person looking to train non-failure. One of his kind of caveats to his stance that you can get hypertrophy at these low RIRs, or high RIRs, I guess, like further away from failure, is that he likes to say that you need to be at least at 80% of 1RM. And so the interesting thing of this statement is that most people at 80% of 1RM are going to be plus or minus 8 rep max. Like, I would say for me, 6 to 8 reps is going to be pretty standard. There's certainly people like females out there that I've seen that could do 80% for 12 or 15 reps. So now we're looking at a bit higher of a rep range. But I think for most people, you're looking at about 8 reps when you talk about 80%. And so his argument was basically like, you could get this hypertrophy further from failure with this volume equated match, as long as you're using these heavy weights. So therefore, the first rep that you do is effective because it's still hard. Whereas if you're looking at low load training, and they actually had some studies in mass that show that you need to be close to failure with low load training. So if you're talking about taking a set of like 20 reps, 25 reps, 30 reps, I don't know, maybe even 15, something like that, then 7 to 8 RIR might not be enough, even if you did tons and tons of volume. Because the weight isn't just heavy enough initially. But to Eric's point about 80% of 1RM being a sufficient amount from the first rep, this kind of goes into something that I mentioned a few episodes ago where Zach from Data Driven Strength was saying, you could do 30 singles at 75 or 80%, something like that, where it's heavy. And none of those singles are even close to failure, but you're getting 30 singles at 80%. So that's the same amount of volume as doing like 4 sets of failure at 80%. Say you go like 8, 7, 7, 6 or something, you get 30 reps. So basically you're doing the same amount of reps at 80%. One, you're doing 30 singles, which potentially takes you 45 minutes or something like that. And on the other side, you're doing 4 sets that with a 2 to 3 minute rest in between takes you 12 minutes or something like that. So we have this like opportunity cost of practicality that I think kind of just makes it not worth it. Like even Eric wrote that in his thing, is he's like, if you're going to work at an RPE 4, this is his quote, it's not, quote, worth it in the grand scheme to do a bunch of sets at RPE 4 as you have to do around twice as many sets compared to being a bit closer to failure. So I think that like when you look at this argument on a practical basis, that makes the most sense. And I think extrapolating that out to that question that I asked in the beginning of the episode of like, if it's so easy to get hypertrophy and you can train at 8 RIR and get hypertrophy, then why do we see these people in the gym spinning their wheels and making no progress over years and years and years? And it's because they're not doing 30 sets or 20 sets or however many sets they're going to have to do if they're going to train at these further proximities from failure. They're basically being like, okay, the prescription on the program is 4 sets of 8 to 12. So I'm going to do 4 sets of 8 to 12, but they're just using a weight where they probably could do 20 reps and they're just stopping at 8 to 12. And that just is going to be ineffective.
Yeah, I think you covered that like really, really well and covered like the different points, but then how, as much as I kind of hate to say it, like that when you did a really, really good job of presenting how what they're saying like isn't that, we're not at polar opposites, which is what it makes it sound like. So with that, with Dr. Eric Helms about that, you could potentially even get hypertrophy. I think maybe using some nomenclature there is important because how much is it maximizing? I think those are things I'm not leading to one way or another, but when people speak about these things, words are important is what I'm getting at. But at an 80%, and let's say 80% of a 1RM, we're probably talking about more compound type stuff. Some of the takeaways that I guess we could start getting to now is for your compounds, like a barbell back squat, a RDL, an overhead press, a deadlift. Probably don't want to take those to a 1 RIR really, because I mean, the risk of injury goes up there. The fatigue per set performed goes up dramatically. And for things like that, I think it generally would make sense to stop a little bit shyer, but then you're generally not doing deadlifts for sets of 15 or 20 or something like that. So what sounds like the differences in opinions get a little bit closer once we start bringing into like specific exercises and those sorts of things. So I think kind of now, Bryan, if you're up for it, we can start pivoting to some of those of like transitioning from, okay, we have a lot of these differing, I don't want to call them opinions, takes on the research, interpretations of the research. And now we can kind of spin into some like practical takeaways and potential takeaways is a good word to use, I guess.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really, really good point. And I'm glad that you brought that up just now because compound movements, especially like big full body compounds, ones that extend at 3 joints, like this makes a huge difference. So like a deadlift and a squat, you're extending at the knees, ankles, and hips all at the same time. And so one argument that I always see from the non-failure training proponents is like, okay, say you even took a deadlift or a squat to failure, what muscle is failing? And when you actually think about that and you're like, okay, the failing muscle is probably something along your midline, like your low back and your erectors are going to be the muscles that are failing. So then how far from failure are your quads, your hamstrings, your glutes, and the other muscles that you're actually trying to target by doing this movement? And so I think when you start thinking about it that way, it makes almost no sense to take those movements to failure because no one wants to have their low back fail. That is literally like you're just going to cause so much systemic fatigue through your spinal column and not actually stimulate the muscles that you're trying to stimulate. And so if you're even at failure, then you could just throw out there that maybe your quads are at 4 RIR and your glutes are at 6 RIR. Something along those lines, right? So not going to failure could keep your low back significantly fresher. Like every rep that you get closer to failure is going to tax your low back that much more. But the stimulus to your quads and glutes may not diminish that much at all. Like going from what would be a 4 RIR for your quads to like a 5 or a 6 RIR protects your low back significantly, but doesn't change the stimulus to your quads all that much. And then anecdotally, we've had centuries at least a century of experience of people training with barbells, doing squats and deadlifts, and growing their body. So clearly we know that the quads and the glutes and these other muscles that we're trying to target with the squats and the deadlifts will grow under the conditions of a compound movement that isn't taken to failure. Whereas looking at something like to your point, something extending at two joints then becomes a little bit less fatiguing and a little bit more specific. So if you look at something like a bench press where you're extending at two joints, elbows and shoulders, then that is significantly less fatiguing than the squat and the deadlift, which are extending at three joints. And you look at like an RDL, which extends at two joints, is also going to be less fatiguing than a deadlift extending at three joints. And then you can go into what would be considered isolation movements. And now, because the stimulus is so localized, that it would make a lot more sense for you to actually take that target muscle within the realms of failure, because you don't have to worry about the fatigue cost systemically of the low back and things like that.
Yeah, you crushed that one there. I think that was such a really good way to present the information. The one I'll kind of fill some gaps of things that I was thinking as you were talking. Generally, the size of the muscle is also something to take into consideration. Your larger muscles that cross more area can generally be more fatiguing, right? So like taking a set of quads to failure is going to be orders of magnitude more fatiguing than taking a rear delt exercise to failure, sort of thing. So I think in terms of the fatigue and where your recovery capacity is in your current nutritional periodization, in your current phase of life, can all really, really come into play. If you are in a caloric surplus, you are now into maybe early stages of advanced, late intermediate, and you're just really enjoying training and you're trying to maximize the gains that you're making. Yeah, I would say take take a majority of your sets like very close to failure. And then on certain things, like, yeah, bring in some intensity modifiers, drop sets, lengthen partials, and see what your recovery capacity is, right? One of the beauties is like you can kind of push up against that upper threshold and find it. If I were to make a blanketed statement, which I generally try not to do, but in this case, I feel pretty decent about it. If you were to go in any gym and you just like stood in the corner and watched people aren't really training too hard. There's not a lot of people taking things close to failure. And I would bet if you looked at the people who had pretty impressive physiques in the gym, they are generally training pretty hard. This is a slippery slope. One, because there's going to be people in your gym that are on gear who can really pretty much go in there and throw shit around and have fun, and they're going to grow, right? So that could be misleading. But then also the fallacy of an argument that gets made a lot is like, well, look what Ronnie Coleman did and Jay Cutler did and these things. One, it's probably not best to use genetic phenoms as a basis for what 99% of the population should do. It's also probably not a good idea to extrapolate points from people who are using every amount of gear disposable to them because they're professional bodybuilders to a subset of population of 99% of which who will never use steroids. So I think if you really wanted to kind of use that argument, take a look at some of your top natural bodybuilding competitors, right? Like your Alberto Nunez. I'm going to now blank on all the names of people, but like I would start there and go down that list. Bryan, you can probably jump in and help me out there, but I think that's something that's really, really good because there are some people who have like incredibly impressive physiques, and it's something that like, as I go down the rabbit hole and just finding more people on Instagram and stuff, I'm like, why are people not talking about this dude? He has this incredible physique, but he's got 7,000 Instagram followers. You know what I mean? And he's this professional natural bodybuilder who has an incredible physique, but no one knows about him, sort of thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of natural bodybuilders out there that don't train in what I think would be considered evidence-based practice. Although evidence-based practice is now extremely broad with the idea that you can just do more volume further from failure type thing. But like a perfect example I'm thinking about right now is this guy Kendall on Instagram. I think he has 12 or 13,000 followers, kind of like what you said. Coach Kendall, I think is his name. But he's won like a WNBF World Championship 2 times, and he trains with a super bro split, like really far from failure. He does, 20 to 30 sets per body part. He has a chest day and a back day and whatever. And he basically made a post the other day talking about how he never trains to failure. And you watch his training videos and like, you can tell he's training hard and he's targeting his muscles and stuff, but he is further from failure. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have guys in the UK, and like the UK thing is its own beast, like AJ Morris. Exactly. and those guys, because they are heavy on deadlifts, like conventional deadlifts, big into conventional deadlifts. They move a lot of weight and they put a lot of importance on training to failure. No matter the movement, we're going to failure. It can be a deadlift, it can be a hack squat or a back squat or whatever it is, and we're going to failure. We're doing rest pause sets and stuff like that. And they train pretty consistently with lower volumes because of this approach, which is literally the contrast to what this Coach Kendall guy or Doug Miller are doing. So again, many ways to skin the cat. But one thing I was thinking about when you talked about like looking at the way people train and then questioning it is we only know the results they got by training the way that they trained. We don't know what would happen to these genetic freaks if they train slightly differently. So the argument of like, well, Arnold did it, so it must be cool or whatever. It's like, well, could Arnold have had better results if he did this instead? And that's obviously something we'll never know because he's an N of 1. And then the other argument that I'll say is like the longevity piece. And maybe some people don't care about longevity at this point. Like AJ Morris is in his early 20s. A lot of these top bodybuilders that we're talking about, Coach Kendall, I think also in his early 20s, they are resilient. They recover from everything. And so they're probably not super concerned with the potentially degenerative pieces of taking deadlifts and squats to failure over time. Which may be something that 10 years from now, they change their messaging and they're like, hey, I'm in my mid 30s now, like can't be taking deadlifts to failure anymore. So it is all relative to the period of time that you are in your training journey as well. And I think that that's an important piece. But that's kind of, I guess, deviating a bit from this conversation a little bit.
Ever so slightly, but I think it's valid. And here's why. As you progress along your training trajectory and you become more advanced, the amount of fatigue that you can impose in a training session increases as your ability to produce force, because you're getting stronger and becoming, let's say, more finely in tune with how to use your muscles, I guess I should say. And that's an important consideration as well, because if you're late stage beginner, early stage intermediate, like you're training to failure or very close, like a 1 or 2 rep shy, you're not going to be able to create as much fatigue because you're not that like proficient at producing force like you would be when you do the same thing you've been doing for like another 7 or 8 years down the line. So like taking the hack squat is such a great example. Or I'm even going to back up. I have a client who's a very high quality powerlifting client, and we are moving into a fat loss phase. And he's like, I just had this great total. I'm going to step away from powerlifting for a little bit. I'm going to like just follow hypertrophy training and I want to get really lean, right? That's what he told me. And we were like deciding like which exercises he's going to keep in, and the barbell back squat is one he's going to keep in. I'm going to have to communicate with him regularly on modulating how intensely he pushes that back squat, because he's so strong at it, and the amount of fatigue he can create with that exercise, where it might be like you're gonna end up upside down in your fatigue to stimulus if we push the back squat really, really hard, as opposed to taking it to like a 5 RIR and then adding more volume of a leg press or a leg extension or something like that. So that's like another wrinkle in the equation for sure.
Yeah, and then I'm going to just deviate this conversation a little bit further away from the main point and just say that like a really good argument that I like is, you know, if you take a really strong power lifter, potentially your client, because this dude squatted like 600 pounds or something, right? Are we talking about the same guy?
I want to say it was like 574 or maybe
it's fucking stupid, whatever it is. High. Yeah, it's an absurd amount of weight. So if you talk to someone who's a really strong power lifter and you're like, all right, we're going to get your legs bigger, bro. I think we're going to have to increase your squat. Like that's kind of like the antithesis of the actual approach that you would take, right? Like, cause for us normal people, it's like, yeah, if you get stronger, that would correlate to increased muscle mass. But there's certainly a point in everyone's journey where it's like, man, getting that power lifter to squat 610 instead of 574, like, I just don't know that that's going to increase his thigh size all that much, you know? Whereas taking him down and doing these more specific acute exercises that are going to target the muscles a little bit more accurately are probably going to be more effective at actually increasing this person's thigh mass. So that would be kind of one off the cuff example there of
but it's relevant.
Yeah.
So
I'll go ahead.
I was going to say, do you want to get to kind of our wrap up takeaway points now? Or
Yeah. I was just going to say, I'm going to let you wrap this up here in 1 second, and I'm going to wrap up with one thought from me as well. There was a systematic review with a meta-analysis done on training to failure versus non-failure training. And what they basically found was that training to failure was better when volume is not equated, and when volume was equated, there was very little, there was no significant difference observed. It was slightly leaning towards the failure group, but not enough to be considered significant within the like 0.05 range or whatever. So it kind of just, you know, the meta-analysis validates the points that we were making, that practically you could equal the hypertrophy by matching volume with a non-failure group to a failure group. But practically, does that make sense in the confines of how you would want to program for yourself or your clients, and the amount of time commitment and number of sets that you would have to do to facilitate that?
Very great points there. So, I mean, kind of to play onto the back of that, take time into account. If you really do not have that much time to train and you want to maximize the amount of body parts and things you can hit, fewer sets, taking closer to failure is a very, very viable approach. There are certain compound movements that we would recommend not taking to an RIR of death, like your barbell back squat, deadlift, RDL, maybe even like an overhead press. I know personally myself, I wouldn't say injured in terms of like, I've like tweaked muscles like multiple times pushing overhead press too close to failure. And generally, like, you're generally using that for a strength adaptation anyway. And what we know about strength is generally further away from failure is better. This will begin to matter more the further along you get in your training career, as your margins for success of continued hypertrophy become smaller. So if you're very green still, you just need to go in and be consistent and eat quality food, adequate, and just put some effort in, and things will work. And then the last kind of point that I want to make, and granted, this is purely mostly a personal preference. So I don't definitely want to speak for Bryan on this one, but what I do want to close it out on is putting forth more effort rarely works out to be less beneficial in almost any aspect of your life. If you look at other sports, right? Think about like a Kobe Bryant-esque mentality, doing less sometimes, but I would say not as much as the majority generally works out less in your favor, as opposed to doing more, training harder, or especially finding what your thresholds might be. Because if you've never trained to failure, you don't really know where it is. And generally you find that it's much further, like deep into that effort zone than you had originally thought.
Yep. No, I like that point. And I'll also say that if you're using compound movements, and the more compound it is, the more likely that compensations are going to occur, because your body is put into positions where it can use multiple joints to do the task. So say you're doing like a deadlift for your glutes or your hamstrings or whatever, you can easily use more quad, or you can use more low back, or a number of different compensations there. Same thing when you're back squatting. Like, if you're targeting your quads, well, it would be really easy to be like, well, my quads fail, but I still have 4 or 5 more reps in me if I just kind of very gradually let my glutes and low back take a little bit more of this load off of my quads for me. And so where failure is can be very ambiguous. So that would be, I guess, another feather in the cap of staying further from failure on these big compound movements. Whereas when you're doing the isolation movements, you can be more confident that the muscle you're trying to fatigue is the one fatiguing. And so yeah, I think that's a good way of wrapping it up.
Perfect. As always, guys, thank you for listening to Eat, Train, Prosper. Bryan and I will talk to you next week.